Good. Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'd first of all like to thank Books and Books for arranging this evening, this event, and thank you all for coming. And I should also point out that the reason that I'm here is because I now have a consultancy arrangement with the Dumont Conservancy and Monkey Jungle, which I have long admired because it has been one of the key sources of information about primate behavior and reproduction. So I've been following the organization for ages, and I'm very pleased to be able to be part of their planning for the future right now. Anyway, this evening I'm here to talk about my book. That's not my title. It was thrust down my throat by the publisher. My title for the book was Natural Mothers. But the publisher thought better, and so it's now called How We Do It. Whenever I give talks to school classes, that gets an appropriate giggle from the audience. But the reason that I wrote this book, what I tried to do is take a very broad look at human reproduction, to look across primates, to see what we can learn about ourselves by comparing ourselves with other primates, because in some ways we've lost our way. We don't really know what is natural or right anymore, and so my aim was to try to get at least some clues. And the reason I wrote it is that I love teaching. I've been teaching university students for 40 years. And back in Zurich, when I was in charge of the Anthropological Institute, I was doing a course on primate evolution, and at the end of it, a student came up to me and said, Professor Martin said, I really enjoyed your lectures, but what's the point? And I was totally rocked back on my heels because it seemed to me that it should be obvious by the end of the course. But the thing is that people don't necessarily see what the point is, and so that really started me thinking that one day I should write a book where I apply my knowledge of primates for practical use. And I hope that if that student was sitting here tonight, he would now see what the point is. Okay, so what I want to do is to go through the book. I'm certainly not going to try to cover everything. But I'm going to pick out some topics which, for various reasons, I think are particularly interesting. Why do you need so many sperms to fertilize a single egg? And this is important because there's good evidence now that sperm counts are declining worldwide. And we should be worried about that. And in the course of writing the book, it's quite controversial. There are people who deny this is happening in the way that there are people who deny that climate is changing. But it's absolutely obvious to me now, after writing the book, that sperm counts are declining. I want to talk about a little bone in the, well, it's not always little, a bone in the penis, which men don't happen to have anymore. I want to talk about mating arrangements and the idea of sperm wars. I want to talk about the length of pregnancy, and it can be quite practically important. I want to talk about the challenges of human birth and why human birth takes so long and is so difficult. And then finally, I want to talk a bit about possible future trends. Okay, so the first question is why so many sperms, okay? And millions and millions of sperms are needed for fertility. And one of the questions, why do we need so many? And one of the answers to that is this idea of sperm wars, that if there is competition between males, then having lots of sperms is one way of winning the battle. But there is an alternative possibility. I don't want to get into the complexity of that, but basically, during the division that gives rise to the sex cells, sperms or eggs, there's a special process of division of the cell called meiosis, and in that, the chromosomes, the carriers of the genes, cross over and exchange material. It's one way in which variability is produced for evolution to take place. And the important point is these crossovers, the more crossovers there are, the more sperm there are in a mating. And so it looks as though there might be some relationship between the number of possible combinations of the chromosomes and the numbers of sperms that are in the ejaculate. It looks as though it might be some kind of lottery, and that you need to have a lot of different numbers in the lottery. One of the underlying ideas that people have carried along, which I believed for quite a while, is that when fertilization takes place, there's actually a race between sperm, and it's the fastest swimming sperm that somehow wins. And the idea is that somehow it's the best sperm that gets there. Well, the evidence shows that the first sperms to get close to the egg are never involved in fertilization. It's sperms that come afterwards. And so it's not a very simple race, and there is no easy way where swimming fast could pick out the sperms that are going to be best for the next generation. One of the things I worked a lot on is comparisons between species. And one of the problems you hit when you want to compare species is body size, because body size can have all kinds of effects. And so if you're comparing mice with blue whales, then a lot of the differences you see are simply effects of body size. But in this particular case, body size is interesting in another way. Bigger mammals have more cells. So they don't get bigger by having bigger cells, they get bigger by having more cells, okay? And that means cell size doesn't actually change very much. So a blood cell is about the same size in a mouse as in a blue whale. And the same applies to the sex cells. So these are the relative sizes. The mouse egg is actually a bit smaller. The human egg is actually a bit bigger than a whale egg. And if you look at the figures, generally there is no increase in size of the egg or sperm as body size increases. And so this means that sperms are going to have a much more difficult job swimming up the tract in a female blue whale. They've got to travel about 100 times further to get to their goal. And what that tells me immediately is that they can't get there by swimming. It's possible maybe in a mouse that the sperm could swim all the way. There is no way that they could do that in a blue whale. And that alone tells us that there is active transport. It's not a question of sperm swimming as fast as they can. The female tract is actually pumping away the whole time and carries the sperm along passively most of the way. The swimming matters at the last stage of things, but it is not a simple race. Okay, now a basic question is, how many sperms does a man need to be fertile? And people have looked at this in different ways, but this is one study looking at the percentage of conceptions with different sperm counts. And so these are millions, so it's 1 to 20 million and 60 to 100 million. And the red here are the peak fertility, around 40%. And once you get above 60 million total sperm count, there's no change. But below that, the lower the sperm count, the less fertile a man is. So what this tells us is about 60 million sperm are necessary for normal fertility. And we have no idea why. Why do you need so many sperm when one can do the job? Why should you need 60 million? And this is an even better, more recent study where you have here, if you look at this, this is sperm concentration. This is not total sperm count, it's the millions per milliliter. The average volume is about 3 milliliters, so you multiply this by 3. And you see here that fertility increases from 0 up to about 25%. And it flattens off from about here at about 20 million per milliliter, which is 60 million sperm. So we're getting that same answer. that for normal fertility, a man has to have at least 60 million sperm in an ejaculate. That is an amazing number, and we don't know why. And this is important because of falling sperm counts. And all of this started really in 2000. There were suggestions as from 1974 that if you looked back over previous years, you would see slow decline. And these are results from various studies. This is time from 1930 up to 1990. And that shows a progressive decline over time. As I say, it's been controversial, but there are so many studies now, I think the argument is over. The question is, what is causing this and what should we do about it? Oops, sorry. And this is a very recent study that came out just 2 years ago from Israel, showing falling sperm counts. And so this is occurring later. The decline started later, and it's coming down now to the rough figure is about half. So sperm counts get halved in different areas. And one of the problems has been it's occurring at different times in different places, but it's happening practically everywhere, at least in the industrialized world. The problem is we don't really have good data from third world countries, so we don't know whether the same thing is happening there. But in the industrialized nations, Israel is just catching up with Europe, and a similar study came out recently in France. Started later in France, but it's happening. And sperm counts are halving over the course of about 50 years once this process starts, and we don't know why. And one of the alarming things is that the sperm counts are declining. The frequency of testicular cancer and malformation of the male sexual organs are increasing. And there is good reason to believe that these two things are connected. So on the one hand, we've got increasing cancers and increasing malformation. On the other hand, we have declining sperm counts. And this seems to be something that's happening at different times in different places. And one possible candidate here, I think that as a general rule, there are many substances in the environment now which mimic the action of the female hormones estrogens. And one of them is BPA, bisphenol A, which is widely used in various products we all use every day. And the United States uses about 5 million tons of this every year. One of its uses is a hardener for plastics. So if you drink water from a water fountain, probably there's BPA in the bottle, and many baby bottles have been made with BPA to harden the plastic. If you see a triangle with a 7 on it, that means it's got BPA in it, and there's lots of evidence that this is linked to declining sperm counts in men and also to reproductive changes in women. And I knew nothing about this when I started writing the book, and I picked up on this story. And I'm convinced it's not just BPA, there are other substances out there which are known to behave like the female hormone estrogen and which are readily available in the environment. If we take a blood sample from any of you here, there will be BPA in your bloodstream. And industry argues that the levels are too low to cause problems, and that in any case it's eliminated too rapidly from the body to be a problem. But if it's eliminated so rapidly, how come everybody has it in their bloodstreams all the time? And there are lots of experimental studies showing that tiny levels of these substances can cause problems. So I think this is one way in which my interest in evolution has led me to an overview that suggest problems that we need to solve. Okay, something in a lighter vein, the penis bone, or baculum. If we look at a sample of primates, these are X-rays, and you can see there is a bone in the tip of the penis which stiffens it. Most primates have this bone. It's present in most rodents, like rats and so forth, and it's present in carnivores, cats and dogs and bears, and in insectivores and bats. So a lot of mammals have this penis bone. Among primates, there are a few exceptions, and the human male is one of them. But the champion in terms of the size of the penis bone is the walrus. And the largest one on record is 4 feet long. Okay, I'm holding here, this happens to be a fossilized walrus penis bone that was washed up on the shore in Alaska, and it's only about 1.5 feet long, so it's relatively small, but it's still pretty spectacular. And that is in a species where there's intensive male competition. And it looks as though in general in mammals, the more competition there is between males for mating, the more likely you are to find a substantial penis bone. So the lack of that in humans probably indicates that we're not adapted for intensive mating competition. Now, a side story to this is that in Israel, a doctor and a historian got together and suggested that in the Bible, where it says that Adam's rib was removed to produce Eve, it wasn't his rib, but in fact his penis bone. Because the word sailor in the ancient Hebrew actually just means a rod of some kind. And it was translated as rib. And they thought that maybe this was the penis bone, which is actually missing, whereas no human male lacks a rib. But I wasn't terribly convinced, so if you read my book, I'm kind of hedging my bets. But in the meantime, I am convinced that this is probably a good explanation. My problem was that I said most mammals have a penis bone, but hoof mammals don't have them. And so if you think back to when the Bible, the texts of the Bible were being written, what mammals would people have known? And so if they were thinking of domestic hoof mammals, they wouldn't see a penis bone in them either. And I thought, well, dogs and cats, and it seemed to me unlikely that that would be so influential. But my son and I recently translated a French book on cave art, and it turns out that shamanic rites of the type that might be connected with cave art were also connected with bears. And bears have a very large penis bone. This is a shaman's drum, and these are penis bones from the bear. And because bears walk upright, they have a particular status in certain societies, in shamanic societies, in Siberia and elsewhere. And it turns out that until 100 years ago, brown bears were around in Israel. The Syrian brown bear was widespread in that region. It became extinct, but it may well have been the source of that train of thought that actually humans lost their penis bone. Okay, so the next question is mating arrangements. As I've said, in a way, we've lost our way. We don't really know what is natural in a biological sense for humans. And one of the ideas that's come up is this idea of sperm wars. And this idea, I'm amazed that people just accept this idea so readily, because it means that you need direct competition between ejaculates from two men. So this seems to me hardly likely to be occurring on a regular enough basis to have influenced human sperm. To try to explain why we need 60 million sperms per ejaculate on that basis seems to me very far-fetched. But there is a serious question about whether there is competition. And what we can do is look across primates and look at social systems. And if we look at social systems across primates, there are different groups. In each case, the dark symbol is the male and the light symbol is the female. And there are monogamous primates where you have a male and a female and the offspring. And the animals that Sean did her PhD thesis on were small New World monkeys which live in monogamous groups. And then there are multi-male groups where you have several adult males with several females. And you can have so-called harem groups with just one male and several females. And then there are variants on this with fission fusion societies. But the most important thing about these different kinds of primate social system is whether there are several males present in a group or just one. So it doesn't matter whether it's a harem group or a pair. In those groups, you've just got a single male and there is no direct mating competition. But in groups where there are several adult males, like chimpanzees and rhesus monkeys, then you get direct competition. Now, if we look at human societies, ethnographic reports indicate that about 85% of human societies say that they're polygynous, that they have a marriage system with a man and 2 or more wives. And only about 15% say that they are monogamous. And so if we look across human societies generally, the predominant pattern is actually harem-like. There's a male with more than one female. But in fact, many of these turn out to be monogamous by default. If a man doesn't have enough resources, then he ends up with one wife, as in a typical monogamous situation. But the key thing about this is that all of these are single male systems. Polyandry, where you have more than one man, is extremely rare. So all human societies, with a few exceptions, are reporting a system with a single male. And one way we can look at this in primates is to look at the size of the testes in relation to body size. And so here we have testis size, body size, and of course, as mammals get bigger, the testes generally tend to get bigger. But the important thing is, if you look at multi-male groups, the red dots, they are mostly above the line. Whereas the single male groups, either pair living or harem groups, tend to lie below the line. Here is human, an orangutan, and gorilla, the chimpanzee, is up there. And so this has been recognized for some time. Back to the 80s, it was shown quite clearly that in primates with multi-male groups, you get relatively large testes. And the idea is this has produced more sperm for direct competition between males. And it's pretty obvious from the testis size in males, human males, that we are not adapted for that kind of competition. And so here is a picture of bonobo. And the testes are pretty massive. They're the size of a large hen's egg. Each on the right, in an orangutan, test is about the size of a walnut, which is roughly the size of a human testis. So human testes are really pretty pathetic in comparison to something like a chimpanzee. We are not adapted for the kind of direct male-male competition that you get in chimpanzees and rhesus monkeys. There's an additional feature we can look at, which is called sexual dimorphism, which is that if males and females are very different in features other than the sex organs, then that tells you something about social organization. Gibbons, as I've said, are typically monogamous. They live in pair groups. And typically in monogamous primates, you do not get very much difference in body size or other features between males and females. But you do in gorillas. These are also single male groups, but they're harem groups. And so if male and female typically are about the same size, that will be compatible with monogamy. But if you have harem groups, then the males may be much bigger. They can also have secondary sexual features like beards and other striking features. And the fact that men have very distinctive beards compared to women is, to me, a biological indication that we are adapted not for monogamy, basically, but for a polygynous tendency. As I've said, in practice, many men will end up with a single wife as the default condition. There's also something very unusual about humans, which you don't see in any other primate, which is a difference in body composition. Women have far more fat and less muscle in their bodies than men. And if you make allowance for that, then the difference in real body mass between men and women is way above the monogamy threshold. Okay, now the next topic I want to deal with very quickly is the evolution of pregnancy. And pregnancy is actually, or live birth, has been tried out by various groups of vertebrates, animals with backbones. There are quite a number of fishes who have done this, and there are some amphibians, and there are some reptiles, snakes, for example, and lizards that have done this. The only group that hasn't even tried it, as far as we know, are the birds. For some reason, birds have never tried any form of internal development with a placenta. But the mammals have really made a big thing of pregnancy. The fishes and amphibians and reptiles that have done this are in the minority, but there are various experiments with internal development. Stingrays are a typical example, where you have a brood chamber and the fertilized egg, instead of being released, develops within the mother's body. And so the entire group of rays has pregnancy. And there were strange reptiles, rather like dolphins, but definitely reptiles in their structure, around about the time of the dinosaurs. And a lot of the skeletons have been found, and this one was actually giving birth tail first. And so these were pregnant. So ichthyosaurs went in for this. But it's only really in the mammals that it's become a profession. But there is one small group of mammals that still lays eggs, the platypus and the spiny anteater, but the marsupials and the placentals all have internal development with live birth. The placenta is not very well developed in most marsupials, and it's very well developed in all of the placental mammals, and we belong to that group. And so pregnancy started developing back here in the common ancestor of marsupials and placentals about 145 million years ago. Suckling goes even further back, because although these animals lay eggs, they suckle their offspring. And so it looks as though suckling originated 200 million years ago. And it took quite a while before this common ancestor then started retaining the fertilized egg in the mother's body. And so if we look at pregnancy in mammals and humans, for example, the egg erupts from the ovary, starts traveling down the oviduct, and the sperm travel up the oviduct, and they usually meet about here, and that's where fertilization takes place. And as I've said, mammals typically have a very large number of sperm per mating act. But it looks as though they are released slowly, so they don't all arrive at once next to the egg, and so the numbers of sperm around the egg are kept quite low. And then if fertilization occurs, then the embryo travels down into the womb and then implants, and then the placenta is formed. And all mammals have this basic set of membranes that develop. Here's the embryo. This is the so-called amnion, which contains the waters. When a woman loses her waters just before birth, it's this membrane rupturing and losing the fluid inside. That is a kind of fluid-filled cushion to protect the embryo. But the really interesting thing about this, and the reason I want to show it, is that this is exactly the same structure as an egg. So if a chicken lays an egg, it has the same membranes. This is the yolk sac, and this is a thing called the allantois. If a chicken lays an egg, it has yolk in the sac here, and that provides the nutrients for the embryo, and the waste products are stored here. It's a kind of trash can. And so when the chick hatches, the trash can is thrown away and the yolk is all used up. What happens when the egg is retained inside the mother's body is you don't have any yolk, and you don't need a trash can because the mother is providing the resources directly through the placenta, through this outer membrane, and she carries away the waste products. So these sacs, they're blood vessels. Instead of being concerned with what's inside the sac, are concerned with transferring material to and from the mother. This is how evolution works. It's a conversion of existing structures. And there are so many examples. It's tinkering. Natural selection operates on what there is and converts it to something else. And so you have that same basic system, which has been around 500 million years in terms of membranes. And it's simply being converted when the egg is retained within the mother's body. Okay, so over the course of 9 months, the baby develops. And one of the things I've been I'm interested in numbers, so I look at quite a bit of data of various kinds. One of my questions is how variable is the human pregnancy length? It's a very practical question. You know, if your calendar is full of things to do, you really need to have a pretty accurate date of when birth is going to take place. And this is the so-called bell curve. Most things in biology vary in this sort of way. You have an average value, and you have a gradual decline on either side. So particularly small or particularly large values are much rarer. And so the question is, this distance here includes about 95% of the data. So if you have a 9-month pregnancy on average, the question is, what is the variation so that 95% of births will occur within that? Well, the bad news is, using the standard approach to this, it's plus or minus a month, okay? So there's a 2-month variation in the date for 95%. There are another 5% that occur even outside of that zone. But for 95% of pregnancies, they're going to be between 8 and 10 months long. We can do better than that, but generally medical science hasn't bothered. These are real data from a huge sample of 1/3 pregnancies. And you can see the 95% confidence limits. Yeah, this is the 67%. So human pregnancies measured in the way that we measure them are very variable, and it's very difficult to get an accurate prediction of the birth date. One of the reasons is that there is no external sign of ovulation, of a release of an egg from the ovary in women, so we have no direct way of knowing when fertilization occurred. What we do in medical science is take the beginning of the last menstrual period and date from that. And that is taken as 40 weeks from the beginning of the last menstrual period. And that adds this additional variability. If you actually know when the egg erupted from the ovary and you have a good date for when fertilization occurred, you can do better than this. We have the means, but we never do it, or rarely do it, except in cases of medical problems. That's bad enough, but it gets worse, because if you have multiple infants, then things are different again. And if you go online, you can find programs, you feed in your dates, and it will give you an expected birth date. Okay, well, that will be plus or minus a month if you're having a single infant. If you're having 2 or 3, it will be very different. And these programs don't tell you that. Okay, and I don't think a lot of doctors actually know this. When we were in London, a friend of ours, a doctor, was pregnant with twins, and she turned up about a month before her expected birth date and asked us to look after her 2 other children because she had to dash into hospital to give birth. And so I always thought this rather amusing that a doctor really couldn't get a better prediction of birth date. But I didn't know at the time. I found this out in the process of writing the book. It's logical when you think of it. The more babies in the womb, the shorter the pregnancy is going to be, because there's a limit to the capacity. So the average pregnancy for twins is not 40 weeks, but 37 weeks. Okay, 3 weeks earlier, plus or minus a month. And the problem with multiple births in humans, they occasionally occur in great apes as well. They're unusual in humans. The average worldwide is about 1 in 80 births will be twins, and the other 79 will be singletons. But it's impossible to predict exactly when the birth is going to occur. But the other problem is that any baby born less than 37 weeks after the last menstrual period is by definition premature. So if the average for twins is 37 weeks, that means half the babies have to be premature. If you have triplets, it's 90% of the babies by definition are going to be premature. So it's a major problem with multiple births. Now, frequencies vary around the world. If we look at a worldwide picture in third world countries, you get relatively low frequencies of twinning in South America and in Asia. You get moderate rates in the northern hemisphere, and the highest rates for some reason are in Africa, particularly tropical West Africa, where you get peak frequencies. There's a very nice mathematical relationship called Helen's law, that if you know the frequency of twins, you can calculate the frequency of all the other things. Okay, the frequency worldwide, the probability of having twins is 1 out of 80, and probability of having triplets is 1 out of 80 squared. Probability of having quadruplets is 1 over 80 cubed, and this is predictable if the probability is a fairly standard probability of having 2 eggs fertilized instead of 1. This is totally predictable. But the base rate varies somewhat in different countries. But in the United States, it's about 1 in 80. And so the chance of having triplets, 1 in 80 squared. And here's the relationship between the number of offspring. So 40 weeks for the singleton, 37 weeks with twins, and less for triplets and quadruplets. And you can see that they don't grow so much if you have more than 1, and that's why you get premature birth and they're not so well developed. Okay, challenges of human birth. Human birth is particularly drawn out and painful compared to other primates. Usually in primates, birth takes 1 or 2 hours instead of about 8 hours on average for humans. It gets better with subsequent births. The birth tends to be faster, but it's still a drawn-out process. And one of the problems is getting the baby's head through the pelvis. And in order for that head to pass through the pelvis, you have to have a strange rotation. So when the baby's head starts going through the pelvis, it's actually facing from side to side. And then it has to turn another 90 degrees. And it's actually facing backwards when it comes out. It's unique among primates. In all other primates, the baby faces forward and it just comes straight through. And so all of this is necessary because we have such large heads. And in fact, there's evidence that there's pretty much selection. But I told you that typically you get a bell curve. But if you look at the size of the baby's head, the bell curve is truncated here. You don't get many human babies with really large heads. These have been selected out. And you get the opposite with the pelvis. You don't get very many really narrow pelvic canals. So you get a truncation at the bottom end. So there's clear evidence of selection on the pelvis to enable human birth. In fact, there's a way of testing that it's the pelvis that constrains birth, because dolphins don't have a pelvis. And dolphins give birth to babies. There are dolphins that are about our size. They produce babies that are twice as big, with brains twice as big. If you don't have a pelvis, it's easy. But we have a problem because we have such big brains. And so that is why birth has become particularly difficult. And it's not just that we have big brains, we actually push things to the limit. Our babies are twice as big as chimpanzees and gorillas at birth. So we're producing larger babies, and they have a large amount of fat that's laid down during the last 3 months of pregnancy. That is a fat reserve. It's an insurance policy for brain development after birth, to make sure that the baby's brain can continue growing very rapidly after birth. And so these are MRI studies showing that fat which is laid down underneath the skin and makes our babies particularly plump looking compared to great apes or a rhesus monkey, which are essentially shriveled at birth. They don't have those fat deposits. Now, one of the things I didn't expect, this came out just while I was writing the book, I found out about this, that in the last part of pregnancy, a woman loses 5% of her brain matter. Okay? These are MRI studies that show that 50% of a woman's brain mass disappears during the last 3 months of pregnancy, which almost certainly is going into those fat reserves for the baby prior to birth. And it then takes her about 6 months after birth to restore those fat reserves to their original, but this is about a 5% drop that's seen in women. So women are actually sacrificing their own brains to produce that large brain of the baby. Now, I just want to say a few words, because whenever I give a talk about human evolution, I generally get the question asked us, well, what about the future? And the trouble is with the kind of work I do is it's historical. I can reconstruct what happened, but it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen in the future. There are people who make assumptions that, for example, our eyes and brains are going to continue getting bigger. But there's a problem with brains getting bigger because of that pelvic restraint. And I don't think that's going to happen. But I think there are going to be trends which are in the opposite direction, which are going to be negative things. And one of them is Caesarian section. Now, Caesarean sections have saved many babies' lives, and for a small percentage of births, they are essential. But in the United States, the frequency of Caesarean section 25 years ago was 7%. It's now 33% and rising. So 1 in 3 babies in the United States is now born by Caesarean section. And if you look around the world, it actually, there are higher figures elsewhere. So the United States, this is a few years ago, it was 29%. It's now, as they say, about 33%. But if you look around the world, there are places that have even higher figures. And the latest figures for Asia, this is South Korea with almost 40%, Taiwan with 35%. The latest figures for Asia are getting up to 50% and above. And in Asia, one of the features is propitious birthdays, that there are good dates on which to be born, and so you can arrange to have a cesarean on that day. And so there are special factors that can play a part here, but by and large there is a huge push to have more and more cesarean sections. And there are places, the latest reports I've seen in South Africa and in Brazil, there are private clinics where we're getting up to 90% cesareans. And so if that continues, of course there is no pelvic constraint with babies born by cesarean. We remove that selection on over large heads and over small pelvises. And one of the things that goes along with cesareans is you get increasing prematurity. The twinning rate is also going up, partly because of in vitro fertilization, where more than one embryo is transferred to improve the chances. And another factor here, which surprised me, is that as women get older, they are more likely to have multiple births. And because the average age at which women are having births is increasing, the percentage of multiple births is increasing. All of this is leading to a progressive rise in prematurity, which is bad news for the baby, introduces all kinds of risks, which we have to counteract. And I was particularly amused by this. There was a very nice paper on domestic dog breeds. And with wide-headed dog breeds, the cesarean rate is around 90%. So only 1 in 10 bulldogs and so forth are giving birth naturally. Most of them have to be operated on by the vet. And if we don't do something, we're going to end up like this. Okay, so that's the end of my quick survey. I'll be around to sign books afterwards if anybody wants. So I just want to leave that up there. It's my personal website, which you can have a look at if you want to follow up on any of this. I also do a regular monthly blog for Psychology Today, and so several of the topics I've covered this evening are covered in more detail there. So I recommend that you use those if you want to follow up. Thank you for coming.
Folks, we have just a few minutes, so if there are any comments or questions for Dr. Martin, now is the time. Feel free. It's always tough for that first hand to go up. Anyone? There you go.
Okay, so you said, that there's a picture about people predicting the brain size and the eyes are going to get bigger, right? So if you don't think that's what is going to happen, like, do you have any thoughts about, your thoughts about what might happen, right? How might things evolve in the future given either this natural path of evolution or because of these environmental factors that are being introduced?
Yeah, one example, I mean, eye size is very difficult to predict, but people, one of the expectations, those illustrations came from an article about what we might look like in the future, but brain size is quite interesting because brain size potentially could get bigger. If everybody were born by cesarean, there would be no pelvic constraint. So babies could be born with ever larger heads, maybe even as like dolphins. And they would literally have a head start in life if they did that. So in fact, there is a possibility that human brains might get bigger. The problem is I don't think there's any close connection. I talk about this in my book. I don't think brain size is connected in any simple way with ability. Okay? I mean, think about this. Women have a 10% smaller brain than men. But there was a beautiful article in Science on intelligence tests. There is no difference between men and women in ability, and yet they have different brain sizes. I don't believe there's any simple relationship between the size of the brain and what it can do.
Anyone else? Well, if there are no more questions, I want to mention that over here at the table, as you come in, you could fill out a card for a raffle sponsored by the Dumont Conservancy. For those of you watching on the internet at home, there's still time for you to get a copy of tonight's book and shipped to wherever you are in the U.S. free of charge. Just to call the number on your screen. For those of you here in the house, we have the book for sale at the counter over there in the front room. Dr. Martin's going to be signing over there at the table to the left of the screen. So please give a hand for Dr. Robert Martin. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.